Okay, Mike, can you hear us?
Yep, everybody's ready. All right, we're good to go. Then I'd like to call to order this meeting of the Hartford Select Board on Tuesday, December 20th, 2022 at 4:09 p.m. Our first order of business is the Pledge of Allegiance. If anyone would like to lead us, please do so.
I will.
Okay.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic which stands one nation under God, indivisible, liberty and justice for all.
All right, thank you very much. We're all gathered here a little early because we're going to hear from the Vermont Bond Bank. First, I think I'd like to express on behalf of the board our very deep appreciation and thanks for the employees of the town, Department of Public Works, fire, police, and everyone else who helped us get through this storm. You all did a great job, and we're really very thankful. All right. So Vermont Bond Bank, the Hartford Benchmark Assessment. I don't know if I want to turn it over first to Gail, and she can introduce this and lead us into it. I assume. Yep. Thanks, Gail.
Sure. So on the Zoom call, we have Michael Gaughan and Ken Line, and I'm sorry, Ken, if I killed your last name. Annually, the bond bank provides us an assessment for the town, looking at our debt levels that we have, and also gives us an idea of how we compare to other communities within the state. So with that being said, I'll turn it over to Michael and Ken, and I had only received one question, which they have answered already. It was from Mary. She had a couple questions on a couple of the loans that we had and some language. So other than that, we don't have any immediate questions for you, Michael or Ken. So we'll let you do the presentation, and as it unfolds at the end, everybody will have an opportunity to ask you questions.
Okay, terrific. So thanks, everyone. Nice to see all of you. Michael Gaughan, I'm the Executive Director of the Vermont Bond Bank. I'm with Ken Linge, our loan officer, and it's a pleasure to be talking to all of you outside of just the normal loan issuance cycle. This is, I think, the second time we've done this for the town. We like to be helpful whenever we can be at helping towns assess their, relative debt position. And so with that as kind of an introduction, we can jump into the presentation that we prepared and sent to Gail previously. So I guess here I
can share my screen if you want. Is that easier, or do you want to?
If I have control, I can do it right here.
Oh, looks like he's got it.
So bear with me. Here's my mouse. Okay. So just kind of a little bit of disclosure before we get going. We're oftentimes, a common question to the bond bank is, how much debt can we afford, or what is our overall debt capacity as a town? And so, one part of that answer is hypothetical or subjective based upon the values and priorities of that particular community. And another part of that answer that is commonly used in the government finance space is benchmarking. And benchmarking is saying, how do we compare to another similar community? And typically in the debt or financial ratio world, that's done using financial ratios. And so to help inform that, what the bond bank has done over the past 3 years is, as part of our annual monitoring of our portfolio of loans, we require and ask that borrowers provide their financial statements. We then take the data from those financial statements, we enter them into a database, and we create portfolio-wide medians that are then can inform questions and discussions like we're having here today. The problem or considerations of that are that the median sized community in Vermont is 1,800 people. And as we'll talk about in a little bit, that may or may not be comparable to Hartford. We also are able to pull data from Moody's Investor Services, which is a credit rating agency. And in some cases that's useful, but in some cases, New England tends to look different from some of their medians. So with that as a background and that disclosure, I'll hand it over to my colleague here to start talking about some of the observations that we've made.
Great, thanks, Michael. So yeah, as Michael alluded to, Hartford is larger than the average Vermont town by quite a bit, and so that keep that in mind as we look at medians. It generally speaking, it probably makes sense for a town the size of Hartford to have more debt. So that's just worth keeping in mind. Obviously, town has a strong cash position, which helps in the event of uncertainties. It's also so generally speaking, maybe I should back up a second and say that we're talking about governmental activities. We're talking also about water, and we're talking about wastewater here, sort of in separate buckets. And that's kind of.
And can I interrupt you for 1 second? I think I'm getting notes the public is seeing presenter view of your presentation.
Okay.
So I'm not sure if there's a way to. So I think it's both hard to read and we see all the other stuff on there.
Yeah, it had live captioning. I've never seen that before. How about I don't know if it's helpful with Gail if you pull it up. I don't know if that makes a difference here, and we can just describe it.
I certainly can. Just open here. Come on.
Okay, terrific. We're on slide 3, I think.
Yeah, the next one. So here, I was just kind of going over some of these bullet points, kind of general observations. And like I was saying earlier, the presentation is broken up into basically 3 parts: the governmental activities, and then water, and then the wastewater system separately. I think probably the main event here is governmental activities. And as I was saying, Hartford is a bigger town than the average Vermont town, and so some of these things that we're going to note relative to medians, make sense. We're not sort of trying to call them out as a problem or anything, but some of those points being that the current percentage of the budget dedicated to debt service is higher than the Vermont median, though in line with Moody's national median for small communities. And the percentage of community wealth dedicated to repaying debt is a bit higher than the Vermont median, but then also, again, within reasonable compared to Moody's medians. The kind of maybe the one sort of theme here is that debt ratios get stressed with a hypothetical issuance of $5 million of new debt. When you get to like $15 million of new debt, we have a chart that shows this more specifically, what the debt ratios look like when you add debt. But at $15 million, they get extremely stressed. And like Michael was saying earlier, again, the best practice for large divergence from debt benchmarks is to plan well for that, and adopt a policy that provides guidance for when and how to restore levels. So a TIF is obviously a tool that you are familiar with and have used, and that's a strategy for tying revenue to increasing debt load in a planned way, and there may be an opportunity there to increase debt through that vehicle. Also, we should note, don't want to sort of oversell or overpromise this, but we should note that there is more federal funding constantly becoming available. It seems like, but more federal funding specifically likely to be available in the coming year through the IRA, through specifically what's called the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund, that we hope to be able to access to help capitalize, especially projects that bring down greenhouse gas emissions. So green energy projects, really of all kinds, from energy production, think solar panels, to electrification, to weatherization. And that could be low interest, long-term loans. And of course, there tax rebates or payments in lieu of tax credits. That there's a kind of a new approach that to the tune of 30% of project cost that could really bring down projects. So back to that point I was making earlier about the debt level being facing stress at a theoretical $5 million new debt issuance. Ways to reduce the cost of that debt service over time, or stretch that out over the long term, play into how much debt could be taken on. Okay, I think we can move on to the next slide. Okay, so here you'll see the in that draft 2022 audit column compared to the Vermont median column, the next column, you'll see that the unassigned general fund balance as a percentage of revenue is pretty close. It's pretty similar. And then, but then if you look at the next column over, the Moody's median is much higher. So that's
and that's common in New England. New England unassigned fund balances as compared to a percent of revenue are generally lower across the board, from your largest communities to your smallest communities. And that is a peculiar fact of New England. Moody's rates people nationwide. The Hartford is generally on the higher side for the state, which is a good thing, meaning you have financial resources available in the event of unexpected events.
Then the next thing to note there is, cash as a percentage of revenue is quite high. Medians, that's speaks to that good management, and to again, to some extent, to a regional tendency. I think here in New England we tend to hold onto our cash pretty well, and that's certainly the case here. If you can go ahead to the next slide. So this is kind of an important one to keep in mind. So, the rate at which debt service declines moving forward is an important aspect of when thinking about how much debt to take on, right? You could look at a particular year and say, well, our debt service is high, so we shouldn't take in any more debt. Well, maybe the next year the debt service is going to drop, and then it'll drop the next year and the next year. Theoretically, that is how debt ought to be scheduled, and generally is how it is, and that is, in some sense, that's what we're looking at. But for several years, the debt service is pretty level. So for the next, certainly like 6-7 years, there's not a clear opportunity to take on more debt, but after 30-35, but it seems like debt service does start to drop off. And maybe that speaks to, I don't want to tell you exactly what this you should do because of this, but maybe it speaks to deferring principal when possible, to going long with taking on debt versus thinking about short payouts, those kinds of things. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and so one of the things that we encourage communities to do, and I sit on an advisory or a standing committee of the Government Finance Officers Association nationally on capital planning, and best practice here is to create capital plans, 10, even up to 25 years to incorporate these types of dynamics. So obviously, you can increase debt to pay for capital. You can also use other types of ways to pay for capital, like grants to the extent that are available, pay as you go or pay go. And so one of the factors in deciding which mechanism to use to pay for capital is, relative debt position, where you stand on these benchmarks that we've described, and when opportunities for to sort of level the benchmarks exists. And because there isn't a clear time in the next 10 years in which the debt levels decline, looking at these other options might be suitable, or you might just say, for some period of time, we might be willing to, increase our leverage and then stick to a policy in which we refer to some sort of median or target level over time.
Okay, maybe go to the next slide then. So this is what I was referring to earlier, where each of these columns is the first column, the draft 2022 audit column, which speaks to where things are, how things stand now, and then each of those columns to the right looks at how these debt ratios would be affected by an additional $5 million in debt. And you see that that like in the second row, with an additional $5 million in debt, the debt service as percentage of operating expenses goes from 10% to 12.5%. That first number is in line with the Moody's median for small towns. The next one is a little bit above, but not substantially. But then you had $15 million in debt, and that's sort of the middle column there, and you get to 17%. And it starts to become a bit of an outlier relative to other small towns nationwide.
And these are obviously static indicators. It's pro forma based upon the existing, and I think these are all based upon the draft audit. So clearly, as revenues might increase over time or expenses might increase over time, these ratios are going to change to some degree. And so it's worth keeping that in mind, but it at least provides you some indication, albeit sort of a static picture of if things were not to change. And but clearly that's not the case. Things do change over time.
One of the maybe the rows to kind of focus on too is the third one up from the bottom: government activities, long-term debt as percentage of equalized value. That is, you see there that the 1.18% is well below the median, Moody's median, and whereas you had $5 million in debt, you're pretty much right there. So, and that suggests maybe there is a little more room, and the 1.88% in that with that $10 million of additional debt, still not super. It's not much above that Moody's median. We see that 0.3% number as the state median number. That's quite low, but as we were discussing earlier, it's maybe not necessarily the right target for Hartford.
And what's nice about that ratio or that benchmark, as opposed to say debt per capita, is that if you have a large base of, say, second homes or commercial activity that is a mix that is different than a purely residential community, it kind of helps to equalize some of those various factors that don't, obviously, if you have a purely residential community, then that debt per capita is very meaningful. But with a mix of uses in a particular community, it doesn't necessarily tell the full story of how services and how debt service are getting paid for.
Could you go to the next slide, maybe? Okay, so back to these same observations that we noted earlier, with those bottom three in red, to kind of make the point that this whole thing should be, all of this information should be taken in the context of planning over time and to diverge from that benchmarks isn't necessarily wrong, but having a policy in place to keep it reasonable over time and then also to think, with that tax increment finance bullet point, to think about how to keep revenues, to drive revenues in a way that's appropriate to justify or balance the expense of the debt service over time. No, go ahead.
I was just, if you were finished.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, I was just going to say, so with those sort of in mind, we talked about kind of opportunities with the greenhouse gas reduction fund that we're working on, but generally in the IRA, I thought it was probably a good moment to pause, see if there are any questions. The enterprise analysis that we did is fairly straightforward, and that for the most part, it's based upon some commonly accepted calculations related to debt service coverage. But maybe this is the one that probably needs more explanation or more a narrative. So if there's any questions, we can answer them now, and then either go through the other ones or just leave it here.
I have a question. Mike, can I do that?
Yes, of course.
Just to expand a little bit on that debt per capita information, the amounts that are here are based on that, like how this is based on if it is primarily residential, and like what did you use for the per capita part of that last line on slide 6?
Yeah, it's quite simple. It's just taking total amount of debt and then our hypothetical scenarios and dividing it by the population of Hartford.
The entire population, so not households, but individual people, including.
Yeah, it's a blunt metric, and obviously, if you have a base of taxpayers or contributors outside of just purely residents, then it's maybe not the most useful, but it is one that some people sometimes use.
And this might be, maybe this is a question for acting town manager, finance director, where in this, where does it come into play, the like physical assets of the town in terms of real estate and equipment? Like do those things impact the sort of our equity in the town and what can be borrowed against? Is that am I making sense of that question?
Are you asking what we have for assets? Does it impact our borrowing ability? That would be a question for Michael. I don't believe that it does. It should be more based on the
budget,
revenue, cash and population and revenues, but I'll defer to them to.
Yeah, there's a couple ways that introduces itself. Number one, in the most broad sense, that ratio of long-term debt as a percent of equalized value is the government equivalent of borrowing against your sort of assets, if you will, because that's ultimately what results in taxes paid that can support the debt. In terms of the actual assets, it's not common practice in the government finance world, except for rare instances like equipment leasing to really borrow against actual assets. So you're really borrowing against the the sort of tax base of the town or the economic strength of the town. And same goes for the enterprise activities, where it's really the revenue ratepayers that is what you care about, and the sort of ability of those ratepayers to make payments and then support debt rather than the assets itself. The kind of flip side of this question is it is increasingly a component of municipal credit analysis to look at asset depreciation ratios. And so we've included those in this analysis. They may or, they aren't engineered. In some cases, they are numbers that are prepared by engineers, but they are numbers pulled from audits. So to the extent that they're telling the story about the true useful life of the underlying assets, is something we can't answer. That's, for your public works folks to comment on. But increasingly making sure that people are aware of their liabilities in terms of aging infrastructure is a key component to think about. And for that reason, the bond bank has made a big push for capital improvement plans over the past year and a half. And just a plug here for all of you, we'll have a forum on this topic April 13th. It'll be our second year running for our capital planning forum to bring awareness and information on the subject of capital planning, because it is so integral to financial health overall.
Thank you. I guess it would be interesting to look at that debt per capita kind of more specifically to what are, like, how many households are carrying that debt. But I don't know that that's a specific request, but I think if there is a way for us to look at that more specifically for Hartford, it would be a valuable number. I don't know if anyone else would be interested in that. Thank you. That's all my questions for that section.
I can tell you that according to the American Community Survey of 2014 to 2018, there are 4,630 households in Hartford. So that's, a little bit less than half the number of residents. So, back in the envelope, you can a little more than double that debt number, and that's the household number.
We don't really, we don't have a lot of, the only issue with that number is we don't have strong benchmarks on sort of what that means in relative comparison. So obviously potentially important for your internal analysis, but in terms of outside comparisons, we don't have a lot. It hasn't been common practice to use that household number.
Gotcha. Thank you.
Did you say the number you're using is 2630? Is that what you said?
4,630 households, but they're ones they used for that were the full population of 10,000.
Okay. Does any other board member have a question? I do have a question, but I don't want to overstep everybody else.
Any questions from the board? Okay, go ahead, Gail.
So can you provide a little bit more clarification? Slide 5 versus slide 5 versus slide 6, specifically about government activities, long-term debt as a percentage of equalized value. You touched a little bit on the percentage, Moody's being 1.5%, ours being as of the end of 2022 fiscal year, it being at 1.18. Question arose based on what you presented. So on slide 5, it was interpreted that Hartford was kind of at the cusp of borrowing based on the values of the debt. And then on slide 6, it kind of gave a little bit of glimmer or confusion with the 1.18% versus the 1.5 for Moody's. So can you just provide what clarification you can as to, is there room? Is there not room? I think that they're great slides, but it's posing a couple of questions of confusion.
Yeah, so on slide 5, that's simply what we call this the debt profile. So what does your debt service look like in each annual year? And what this can sort of tell us is, assuming no growth in the grand list, which is probably not true, if you wanted to stay at 1.18% of total equalized value, when would you have the opportunity to issue more debt? And that opportunity is quite far away, right? So that is 10 plus years out in 34, 35, where you have, and this is common of most towns, at some point there's, a maturity of debt in significant amounts, such that if you held all other benchmarks constant, you would develop some capacity. But even though that's quite a ways off, if you look at debt to full value, what we call grand list here in Vermont, although that's a percentage of full value, compared to the national benchmarks, for similar sized communities, you're less than those which are at 1.5%. So in your case, that's an additional $5 million or so of debt. And certainly there's instances, and it's common practice to briefly exceed some predetermined benchmark that you'd like to stick to as you develop, a significant amount of capital spending. What is relevant for Vermont in particular is that even if you were to exceed that debt, some predetermined benchmark, let's just say it's 1.5%, based on statute, we generally have a level principal payment requirement in the state. So your debt amortizes very quickly. So just as a matter of the way that the debt needs to be structured, you very quickly pay down debt in the state. So that's a relevant consideration as well.
Perfect. I believe that answers the question. Thank you.
Can I just chime in one word to follow up on that? So these, the different, plus 5 million, plus 10 million columns are all based on the same grand list amounts. Like they're not.
That's right.
Taking into account any growth in the grand list.
That's precisely right. It's completely static, just as a starting point.
Thanks.
Any other questions before we go on to the enterprise funds?
Would you like to, I know we don't have tons of time. Would you like us to walk through those or as well?
I have one more question. Sorry. Do you have I don't know if it's appropriate for that. Do you have like blanket recommendations on what our debt capacity currently is?
No, we have some informational pieces on that subject because, as I mentioned before, part of that is based upon the values and the objective of any one community. So ultimately, it's importantly in the hands of that community. We have best practices in terms of using these benchmarks to compare yourself. And if you think that a significant amount of capital investment is appropriate, how to sort of develop policies to get yourself back down to some sort of level that you think is fiscally sustainable. But in terms of like the pure question of debt affordability, debt capacity, a lot of that is there. There's a rich literature behind that is somewhat theoretical. So we leave that in the hands of the community.
I get that, but with the enterprise funds, and I guess maybe we'll get to it, but there's debt capacity analysis in those accounts that we don't see in the government operation. Is that because just within those funds, there's a way to analyze the capacity? Yeah,
that's because in the enterprises work more like you would, they aren't private, they aren't businesses, but they work more like businesses. And so, you have a pretty direct revenue and expense level. And there's some common practice measures in terms of what kind of debt coverage levels to shoot for in what we call a self-supporting type of debt, which is that is supported by user fees like the enterprises.
Gotcha. Okay, thank you.
I actually have another question too. Questions that have come up either by board members or community members. And I'm hopeful that Mike or Ken, you can answer this question. Is there such thing as a floating bond, and what that's been described as a community would apply for a bond, say $5 million, and ask for voter approval on it, but not have specific projects that they want to use the funding for, and they would utilize it over a period of years, and the funds that they don't use would roll over into another bond. I'm fairly confident I know what the answer is, but I know that it's a question that's been asked and been really being pushed. And so just to recap that, is there such thing as a floating bond that can be awarded with no significant projects? And if the projects are completed and all of the funding is not utilized, can it be rolled into a new bond?
Yeah, I'm not familiar with that. I haven't seen that. And I can't speak to sort of the statutory requirements around it. That's a good question for bond counsel. You know, the vast majority of the loans we make are made using tax exempt finance, and under the IRS rules, which we kind of pass down to the communities that we work with in the form of the tax certificate that the community signs, they have to identify that they have specific projects that they will be financing. That can be somewhat general in the sense that it'll be your fiscal year 2024 capital improvement list. But even those, you know, are going to be fairly specified. Now, you know, occasionally things drop out, like projects fall through, but it is the most common practice to identify the projects. And certainly you have to certify that you've identified projects to work with us in terms of taking out a loan.
Thank you for that clarification. The next question I have that's come up is there a time limit when a project's been identified from the time, a time limit for a project to be completed when when we're awarded a bond?
Taking out a loan from the bond bank, that is?
Correct, a loan from the bond bank. Is there a certain period of time that a project needs to be completed during, I guess,
The term of the loan.
Yeah, generally
of the loan, but is it when we apply for a bond, is there a certain time frame that the project needs to be completed within?
Yeah, so there are generally, again, kind of we rely on the IRS. There's rules around this in terms of accessing tax exempt financing, and generally you are trying to have the project completed within 3 years. In this environment, and there are certain spend down ratios that they want to see in that interim, but funds fully expended within 3 years. Now, in this environment, you know, from 2020 to present, things have happened that no one could have expected. And so what we just ask for in those instances is a good explanation for why it happened that we can keep on file. But, you know, that's kind of extraordinary, obviously.
Thank you.
And, you know, if that's going to be a problem, the common practice that people use is, and I'm sure Hartford has used this, is just interim finance to bridge that time period.
So the last question that I have for clarification, there's been questions about buckets of equipment and buckets of infrastructure. And what is the best practice when you have 3 pieces of equipment that total $1 million, useful life of 10 years, you also have a project that is $3 million that has a useful life of 25 years. Are those two items, one being equipment with useful life less than the infrastructure, is it common practice and or best practice to combine those two buckets?
I mean, the way we see this on the equipment side is communities will sort of make a choice as to whether they want to, oftentimes as they're done using equipment lease financing, they certainly could be done as loans with voter approval. But the typical choice communities are making is, do we want to set up a reserve-like system funded with cash instead of doing short-term debt or medium-term debt for those pieces of equipment, given they have a relatively short useful life. And then, preserve that kind of debt capacity that we've been talking about for the longer lived assets where you'll have, community members or the larger community using them over the period of its useful life, and having sort of everyone pay their share into the use of that equipment in a concept we call intergenerational equity.
So just for one more point of clarification, if the community chose to combine equipment that has a lesser useful life than infrastructure, the term of the loan would be structured around the useful life of the lesser?
It could be, I mean, in terms of us, we'd break it out individually. What we've been doing more recently is we'll have one loan agreement and then exhibits for each sort of use of funds. And so if the use of funds is going to be a shorter useful life, we'd have the debt be matched appropriately. Generally, there's no hard and fast rule in the governmental sector for the IRS, but in the nonprofit space, you aren't allowed to do more than 120% of the useful life of the asset finance. So that's generally what we try to stick to.
Okay, so I'm sorry, one more point of clarification. I apologize. These are all questions that I've gotten. If the community was going with the intention that they wanted to combine the equipment and the infrastructure for the sole purpose of extending the debt amount to make it a lower value, if I understood what you just said, each item would have its own schedule based on its useful life. Is that correct?
Yeah, each sort of group of whatever is, equipment we'd sort of do as one exhibit, and that would say maybe be 12 years or whatever is appropriate based upon the engineers or the manufacturer. And then the other item would be, say, 25 years and done as a separate exhibit.
Perfect. Thank you so much. I appreciate you clarifying all of that. I know sometimes individuals can hear it from multiple people, but I think coming directly from you reiterating, I certainly appreciate that. I don't have any more questions on the governmental piece. Does the board have any specific questions on the enterprise funds part of it? As they've indicated, the percentages, but they've given a definition, explanation of what they are. But if there is a specific fund that you have a question on.
Any questions, board? Doesn't look like it.
Don't have capacity. I mean, maybe if you wouldn't mind, we don't have to go through all the slides, but would you mind just touching on those debt capacity analysis slides for each of those?
So maybe Gail, if you wouldn't mind moving to slide 11.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, these debt service coverage ratios imagined with, if the best way to look at them, actually, can you go to the slide 11 to the slide there? There you go. So the water fund is there's a lot of debt capacity in the water fund. And specifically what this slide says is that if you want to maintain a debt service coverage ratio of 1.25 times, which is kind of the standard target.
And that is, revenues less cash expenses, so not non-cash expenses like, depreciation, revenues minus cash expenses gives you net operating income. That number divided by total debt service is the ratio that we're talking about when we talk about debt service coverage ratio.
So if you want to mean that common target of 1.25 times, then you could borrow an additional $3.8 million and be able to cover annual debt service of $236,000 in the current scenario, which is that's a lot of debt capacity. Even though we show these other numbers, the 1.5 times and the 2 times, to kind of give you a sense of how much of a cushion you would have if you wanted to be more conservative in your approach to taking on new debt, and how much debt you could take on in a different, more conservative approach. And in this case, even by taking a 2.2 times debt service coverage ratio, you would still have some capacity, which is not always the case. And actually, that's not the case in the wastewater system.
Right.
And the trade-off is, presumably those coverage levels are high because you're contributing to reserves, as we see in some of the other ratios, and that's that's an alternative method to fund capital investment, and building up those reserves. It takes hard work, and you sort of be commended for that. But when I don't have a great system or great understanding of the water assets there in the town, but to the extent that you need to add leverage, that capacity exists to some degree. And again, this presumes static revenue and expense numbers as we build out these scenarios.
And the wastewater, there's some capacity, but not as much as the water fund.
Correct. Yeah, it's still maintaining that 1.25 times. There's $1.3 million of additional debt capacity, assuming 2% over 20 years. That's significant.
Right. And the reserves and cash on hand look strong for wastewater too.
Yeah, in the sort of assumptions we've made about the debt are consistent with the SRF State Revolving Loan Fund program that we work with. So sort of 2% in either 20 or 30 years or 30 or 40 years, depending on some factors that they can help you work through, are sort of their base terms for what financing is going to look like. So the nice thing about the SRF program, to the extent you're using that, is you have some pretty clear metrics in terms of what you can plan for, and you're isolated to some degree from market volatility.
Thank you. I guess, this may be a question for Gail again. So we're not even looking at solid waste, and because obviously there's no capacity for debt there, but there is need for funding sources there. But I guess so that's just that's just not even something the bond bank looks at in terms of the enterprise.
It's currently an enterprise fund, and they don't have capacity to take on any debt. In order for us to take out debt for the solid waste facility, they would have to be moved back to a governmental fund, which we do have capacity for that.
Great, thank you.
I think that's a good question Kim just brought up. So we do have a solid waste fund that is an enterprise fund, which you saw in our financial statements. They don't have the capacity to take on debt. Would the governmental side be able to take on debt to cover capital improvements there while it's still an enterprise fund, since the government fund is responsible at the end for all the enterprise funds?
Or is it best practice to move it out of being an enterprise fund and move it back to being solely a government fund?
So as a practical matter, about 99% of our portfolio is a general obligation of the community we're working with. But to the extent something is an enterprise, we look at it independent of that hypothetical, or not hypothetical, but that tax backing, that credit enhancement essentially. And we look at it as a self-supporting enterprise or self-liquidating, meaning that the revenues are sufficient to pay back debt service. So to the extent it is a business-like activity, it really is appropriate to look at it as an enterprise and ensure that the revenue is sufficient to, pay debt service. There might be reasons to, and then kind of to what I referenced before, as a practical matter, in all likelihood, it would be a general obligation, as is most things that we work with. And so, but on the enterprise side, there might be some reason to give it support from the general fund for some period of time. But best practice is really to have enterprise funds be self-liquidating or self-supporting over time.
Thank you. I think we're good. I don't think anybody else has any other questions at the moment. And I know Michael and Ken, you'd be more than welcome to take a couple emails at a later date, should any other questions come up after your presentation. Thank you very much for all that you've done. And I think that's a wrap on that part.
All right. Well, thanks very much.
Great. Yeah, thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Take care. Have a good, happy holidays, everyone. Take care.
Thank you.
Okay. Well, we're going to move on from that. Gail, I think you had a comment or two you wanted to make prior to public comment.
I did. I just wanted to take the opportunity to actually name the employees that went above and beyond through this storm. I think we all have realized what type of challenge that it's been for everybody. And I think it's appropriate for me just to take a couple moments to recognize them by name. For a Public Works Department led by Jeremy Delisle, we have Chip Haley, David Faldensby, Anthony Gove, Kieran Hook, Mike Kolosky, Wes Shipley, Gene Tessier, Logan Mess, Evan Eckert, Michael Martin, Kim Nardine Brown, Clayton Whitmarsh, Kyle Moses, Randy Heron, Jeff Lord, Brett Wallen, and Nicholas Whitty. Over at the police department, led by Thomas Howell this weekend, we had Mitch Cable, Jonathan Anglua, Christian Hernandez, Carl Ebenhauser, John Siren, and Corey Centergate. Also at public safety, dispatch was led by Scott Moody, who had Scott Smith, Katie Meyer, Mary Kent, Jeff Mayo, Avery Hodgson, Ty Clark, Christina Kramer, Mike Boudier, and Becky Stearns. And not last but not least, over at the fire department, led by Chief Cooney and Deputy Chief Zora, we had Lieutenant Liberty, Lieutenant Collins, Firefighter Spencer, Firefighter Daughter, Firefighter Rada, Fire Marshal Pelletier, Public Safety Mechanic Paul Saucier, Firefighter Colburn, Firefighter Hayes, Lieutenant Morse, Captain Hannix, Firefighter McMillan, Firefighter Hazalt, Firefighter White, and Lieutenant Quilla. I apologize to all of you if I murdered any of your names, not intentionally, but it was really important that we just take a moment and show appreciation for the numerous hours that everybody put in. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Gail. Thank you for taking the time to recognize those employees by name. And again, the select board, we give you our deepest thanks and appreciation for the work that you did. Okay, so our next segment is public comment. As usual, we will start with people in the room, then move to those joining us by Zoom. If you'd like to comment publicly, please come up to the microphone, introduce yourself, and state your town or village of residence. And you'll have 5 minutes to talk, no personal attacks, and please address the select board as a whole. So we will start in the room. I can't see from the video whether there's anyone in there. So if someone wants to let me know, that would be great.
No one moving toward the podium at this time?
Okay, is there anyone on Zoom?
No hands up at this time?
Okay, well, we will conclude public comment. And now we will also conclude this portion of our business as the Hartford Select Board, and we will reopen as the local Cannabis Control Board. We have our first license to consider today. So we will get right to it. I can't tell if the license applicant is in the room or if they would like to speak to the board about it. They certainly may.
Hi, this is Miriam Wood with the Tea House. I am here.
Hi, Miriam.
How are you?
Very good.
Excuse
Good.
me, I'm sorry. Just to be, Mike, you did move into the local cannabis
I did.
control board.
Yes,
you did. Okay,
Sorry, I missed that. I just wanted to make sure. Thank you.
Sorry, go ahead, Miriam.
So I did prepare a brief presentation. This is all new to us. I don't know if that's actually what you want, given kind of the limited authority of the local Cannabis Control Board. And also my understanding is that none of you have actually seen the application that was submitted to the state, if that is accurate.
Each select board member was provided a packet of the all of the information that we had here in the town clerk's office, which is your application as well as all of the departments that provided approval.
Right, but so they didn't receive what the state actually approved. It was just that form that. For instance, the state received a cash management plan, security plan, our community plan.
I think we saw your general application, but maybe not all the.
Okay.
So,
Right, so part of the requirements is for when we distribute information to the board, that information is to remain confidential. So all of the packet that went along with your entity was not provided to the public, and the information that was provided also has redacted pieces out of it as were required.
Okay, that's helpful to know. So I'm happy to share what I have prepared.
Sure.
And hopefully it's not just a repeat of what you've already seen, but I don't really know.
That's
So
fine.
I do have small PDFs. I can read them for the 3 people on the phone, and I can. And Dylan Price is here as well, the Tea House manager.
Thanks, Dylan.
So our mission is to mindfully curate Green Mountain cannabis products, provide the best quality offerings from across the state, as well as to facilitate a market that assists rural Vermont cultivators and residents so our communities reap the benefits. The Tea House is a minority and women-owned entity. So one of the parts of the application does ask about community engagement and how you'll be kind of engaged with the community. And our response to that essentially is that we'll provide education to community members that desire a deeper understanding of cannabis. We're working to collect donations for local organizations. Our building does have a local art wall where local artists are able to hang and sell their paintings. We plan to buy as much cannabis and other products that have been made in the Upper Valley. We plan on no host events, which I'll explain what those are in a moment. And we also plan to participate and host in Green Up Day and other types of activities that will help the community. No host events. Our idea to do that was based off of what we've seen some people do on the West Coast. What they are is to focus on very specific groups and how cannabis has or could impact them. It's a way for community members to meet each other. It's a way to support other local businesses, and it gives people that may not want to go in a dispensary an opportunity to participate in a neutral environment. Some of the examples of topics include women in cannabis, veterans in cannabis, the elderly in cannabis, the LGBTQ community in cannabis, and the history of cannabis. Currently, the tea house has 7 employees. I am the general manager. Dylan is the dispensary manager, and we've hired 5 dispensing agents. Lastly, what we're doing to keep our products away from minors, to enter, you must be 21. If you do not have a valid ID, you cannot enter regardless of your age. IDs are checked at 2 points. They're checked upon entry and also at the point of sale. We have limited the purchase of vapes to 2 per customer, which is well under the legal limit that we can sell. Our logo, our Instagram, and our webpage does not contain any type of flashy graphics or colors that could appear to youth. And of course, we want to educate our customers as well. And that was it.
Thank you. Are there any questions from the board? No questions. Okay. I would be willing to entertain a motion.
I will move that we approve the cannabis license for applicant number S-000001203.
I'll second.
Okay, we have a motion and a second. Is there any discussion? Okay, seeing none, we will vote.
Mr. Chair?
Yes, Raga?
Oh, I just want to congratulate Miriam on the effort of bringing this forward. I know this is a new industry and field for us to all be moving into, and I felt like it was done very thoughtfully.
Thank you.
Thank you, Rocket. All right, I'm going to do this one by roll call because we're all sort of dispersed, here on Zoom. So I will call the roll. Kim.
Aye.
Dan.
Aye.
Mary.
Aye.
Allie.
Aye.
Rocket.
Aye.
Lanny.
Absent.
Absent. And I will vote aye. So there we go. Congratulations. Yes, absolutely.
If
All
I could
right.
just ask
Yeah.
one quick follow-up question, will the town clerk then send that to the Cannabis Control Board tomorrow?
Correct.
Do you know that's the next step? Okay. All right, thank you. Have a good
Great.
night.
Thank you.
Mary and Dylan.
Okay, so we will end that portion of our time together as the local Cannabis Control Board, and we will come back as the Hartford Select Board. I will take a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
Second.
Okay, all those in favor say aye. Aye.
Aye.
Aye.
Nice.
Aye.
All right. Thank you very much, and I'll see y'all next time.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Merry Christmas and we'll see you next week.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a start. That's great. I'm just gonna send these minutes to Anna before I leave.
Our mics all.